Hey everybody, and welcome back to Parkitect. Today I'll be playing Highway Hijinks, which is a park in a few acres of flat land according to the description, and as a Dutch person I want to argue with their definition of flat land, but it's actually a pretty fun scenario. I haven't played it so far, but I've worked on the map a little bit because this is actually a scenario that Joshua made. But when the developers decided that they wanted to have trophies in each of the scenarios, they asked me to add some scenery to the scenario, like the bridge that you can see there, to actually add a trophy which you can get by the time that you get to the end of the scenario. So let's just see what this map is actually like and what we need to do here. Also, I'm sorry about spoiling what the trophy is going to be for this map. This was one of the rare cases where I had to do this though. Most of the trophies of the maps were pretty much already there when they decided to put the trophy system in place. So we need to get 550 guests in the park, have an overall park rating of 80%, and then there are some optional goals, one of which we can get by the time we get halfway through the scenario. Now what I think is the most interesting about this park is the fact that we do have a highway running through the middle of it, which is very similar to an old roller coaster tycoon scenario called Funtopia. Although some of the differences are that while Funtopia was already a pre-built park with some roller coasters and rides, this one is more or less empty and quote-unquote flat. And also what's really cool is that we actually have some cars and trucks driving through the middle of the park here. Now the goals of this scenario aren't too difficult, but I do have to say that I might want to get into some research because we only have a few flat rides here, and 2 coasters, and really no big coasters. So I'm definitely going to start out with some research on roller coasters, maybe on some transport rides as well, because this is quite a sizable park and I do want to have some way to transport people around. And maybe some water rides as well, because as somebody pointed out on the second to last episode, I haven't built many water rides yet so far. I think the log flume from Mystic Oasis was the only one. So that's something that I should focus on a bit more in the future. For now though, I'm gonna get started on this scenario and we'll see what comes out of it. Alright, so I'm starting this scenario by removing some of the paths that the game has given me. Not really out of a distrust of path systems that you get right from the get-go of a scenario, although that is definitely something you should always consider, but more or less because I saw the pond in the middle of the park here and I figured that this would actually be a very good place to center the park around. So I'm building some small boulevards alongside the water here to make sure that we have this open space in the middle of the park centered around the lake. So I can start building rides and buildings, etc. around that and kind of start working on some sort of skyline. It's always good for some sight lines to center around a water element. And then above the carousel, which is the classic first ride of the park, I'm building a roof as well. And coming back to the Batavia K episode, shout out to somebody called Jesse Mullen, who in the comment section replied to my whole question about why these roofs are called Dutch hipped roofs. Because like he said, you definitely don't see them in the Netherlands per se. They are apparently very common in Australia and Polynesian areas, the Caribbean, etc. But you don't really see them in the Netherlands. And his theory was that it might be related to the Dutch East or the West Indies. I think he actually referred to the West Indies, but yeah, it's hard to keep track of all of that colonialism. But yeah, that was all just speculation as well. I still haven't been able to find out why these roofs are called Dutch hipped roofs exactly, but it's an interesting history. Definitely not a very Dutch thing, but for this park I'm not really going for any specific theme in particular, so I think it works out. It's another kind of way to build some sort of variation on the roof over a flat ride so that I'm still not running out of ideas for these things. And on this side I'm building a small food court, and for the first time in my entire playthrough I decided to use the customizable stalls, which are super handy if you're building indoors like this. For one, you don't get any decorations on top of the stalls. Sometimes if you put a burger stall inside a building, you might get some parts of the burger popping out of the walls, things like that. So you can prevent that from happening with these custom stalls. But also they can sell anything that any of the rides or any of the stalls that you've unlocked can sell. So it's really handy for if you want to sell a particular item, but you don't want to build it anywhere. In my case, I wanted to sell the stuff that they sell in the vending machines because I didn't have a drink stall, but I did want to sell drinks. So instead of researching an actual stall and hoping that I could get a drink stall, I'm just getting a regular stall to sell drinks, which is going to be good because this can actually be serviced from the back, so that supplies are going to be able to be given to the stall from the back, which can't happen to a vending machine. You're always going to have to supply a vending machine from the front. So logistically, this is just a bit better. And then in the stall next to it, I think I used a regular stall to give it the workings of an info kiosk, I think. So it's going to sell park maps, so that's going to be quite useful as well. And then the other one is one that I also haven't seen so far. It's selling cakes. I forgot which kind of cake it was exactly, but I noticed that not only did it decrease hunger, it also increased happiness. So funnel cakes, that's the one. So that's going to be very handy. And then there's another store which I forgot about. But yeah, everything is pretty much covered by these buildings, from park maps to drinks to food. I only need to put a toilet building at some point in the near future. And this is practically one building. And I'm going for a sort of generic modern building style for this park, and I'm trying to take as much as I can the materials and colors from the pre-built areas of this park, but at the same time I didn't want this to become a drab modernist area, so I'm adding some slight variation and sort of imitating the look of old town facades, but with some slightly more modern architecture by having these buildings like this, by having sort of 3 different facades, even though it's just one building. I honestly, personally, kind of like that, because for me, in general, the attractiveness of traditional buildings doesn't per se really come all that much from their details, but really a lot also from the way that they are laid out and the scale at which they're built and their composition. So I tend to also just like modern or postmodern buildings that follow the same kind of general shape and try to maybe even blend into their surroundings in such a way. Although I don't want to get too political here. That's just my own kind of flavor or my own kind of taste in buildings that I try to add in a little bit here. And also, I'm adding a top spin because I do need to get some intense rides. Even though the top spin in the game doesn't really have very high stats, there are actually going to be some guests who think it isn't intense enough for them, so I will have to build some kind of intense roller coaster. But for now, I think it should be good. So I opened the park with that, having the top spin and the carousel, which I forgot to open so far, but that should be a good, decent start to the park. And also, what I finally built, which I should be building a bit more in these scenarios, is a small open area with some benches and litter bins and parasols, just as a general outdoor seating area. So far, I've kept most of my seating indoors or just in the same buildings that the stalls are in, but adding these outdoor areas, I think, definitely adds a flair of realism to the parks, because you tend to see these kinds of areas quite a lot in real theme parks. So they're very good filler as well, I would say, to bring different areas of the park together. And then I'm also adding the jumper flat ride, because that was also one of the few flat rides that I got right from the start. At this point, I'm basically just running the game, waiting for my research to unlock the next coaster, which I didn't yet know what it was going to be. I just left a general area on the top left open there for the coaster to be built in. And yeah, I'm really just waiting until that is unlocked, because without a roller coaster, this park is never gonna run a profit. And really, in general, I would say that's the most crucial thing about doing scenarios in Parkitect. You want to get one kind of roller coaster at least right from the get-go, because they tend to make much more profit than any of the flat rides. Which makes sense. It's always kind of been that way, but it's actually kind of difficult to run a profit on flat rides and stalls alone. So roller coasters really help out a lot here. Although I do like adding the flat rides to flesh out this area, and so I'm also adding the Ferris wheel there, which is just a nice little addition in that area. Anyway, at this point I finally unlocked the coaster, which turned out to be the monorail coaster, and at first I wasn't really too happy with this. I was hoping to get some kind of more typical roller coaster, like a floorless coaster or, you know, some kind of steel coaster. But this is quite a niche coaster, really. But I think it's a really fun coaster anyway. So I'm just going to roll with this because the other ones that I had unlocked are the Wild Mouse and the Junior, which aren't going to make me enough money. So this one will have to do. Decided to add the standard steep lift hill that you tend to see on these things. But the rest of the layout is going to be a bit different because unlike the real life monorail coasters of this model, which are all really compact, I want to make this one a bit more spread out and give it some more interaction with the rest of the park. So I'm starting off with the steep lift hill and then following that, the Rmc Wildfire Drop, which we haven't seen on this type of coaster before, but Rmc has done it on Wildfire, for instance, so I think it might work on this coaster type. Into a zero-G roll over the paths, which is just one of the best elements to have path interaction with. A zero-G roll just looks really cool. Into a Cobra roll, which is another new element for this coaster type, but I think it might work. And then into an airtime hill, and then some twisted sections before we get into some block breaks. And after the block breaks, there's a dive drop, which is something that you tend to see mostly on B&M Wing Riders, but I think it works out quite well on this coaster. You know, it gives a bit of a slower moment because these layouts tend to be really fast. I don't know if the friction on these coasters is entirely realistic, although in real life these are super fast as well. But even here in Parkitect, it is really hard to run out of speed with these coasters. They just run at crazy high speeds. So I added the block breaks in the middle partly to improve the throughput of this ride because they are only one seat across, so they're very inefficient if you don't add enough block breaks. But it's also really there to slow down the coaster during the middle of the layouts and add some time where you can actually catch your breath because these things are really fast and intense. But yeah, after that dive drop, we have some low segments with a quick overbank turn into a barrel roll, into a helix, and finally back into the final brakes. And since I do have that extra mid-course block break section, as well as the block breaks at the end of the layout, and they are spaced out pretty decently, I can run 3 trains on this coaster, which is absolutely amazing. I think this is actually my first 3-train operation in any of the scenarios so far, and I definitely need that because these trains can only seat 8 people at a time, because they're just so small, so I'm gonna need all of the efficiency that I can get. I know that I haven't made every coaster in the scenario playthroughs very efficient so far, and some of them could have actually used some extra block breaks, but with this one being the first coaster of the scenario and seeing that I wasn't making a profit at all before I built this coaster, I really wanted to make sure that I got the efficiency on this ride and that I make as much money off of this as I can. Now into the scenery, the station is quite simple. For the first time I'm using this kind of barn roof with the slightly less steep roof on the front. I'm not entirely sure how well it works on this station, especially considering that the other roof over the station is a regular gabled roof with some flat parts on the side. So yeah, I'm not too sure how much I like the overall roof structure on this, but there's some fun elements in here that I can definitely reuse in some of my future playthroughs. And finally, I'm just sprucing up the whole area around the lake a little bit more, adding in all of the fences and the foliage, and also finally the toilet building, because I realized that I still hadn't built the toilet building at this point. So my guests must have been dying to go take a shit, although I do have to say I didn't notice anyone complaining. I was checking the guests' thoughts, and even though they were complaining about some vandalism and some of the paths being dirty, and they were complimenting the Raptor entertainer as well, they weren't actually complaining about not finding a toilet anywhere, which I thought was peculiar. Maybe I just hadn't run the park long enough for people to start having to go to the toilet. But apparently it's fine if you start the park without a toilet and only build one later on. It's not too important to note, but for me, as someone who tends to forget placing toilets, it does mean that I don't have to begin a catastrophe every time I start a scenario and forget to place down the toilet again. Anyway, that'll be it for this time lapse, so let's quickly check how the park is doing. So the park is doing quite well, and I'm making sort of a devilish amount of money at this point. But yeah, altogether, this coaster here definitely saved me, because this is making a very good profit, and it's definitely the only reason why I'm not losing massive amounts of money at the moment. Even the Ferris wheel is actually tanking, although not at the moment, but for most of its time it is. So yeah, it's definitely the roller coaster that saved the park here. And speaking of roller coasters, when I reached one of the goals, which is the halfway goal of getting 250 guests, I unlocked the Giga Coaster. And I'm not sure if I actually want to build that one, because it's quite expensive and I'm actually not that great at it either. I don't think I've built many layouts with it yet. So we'll see what I do with that one, or if I end up building another type of coaster. I also unlocked the Tourbillon, which is not the greatest flat ride, I have to say, because even though I think it looks amazing, I already have a regular topspin in my park, and this is pretty much just a topspin on crack, so I'm not sure if I'm going to build that one. But basically my plan right now is to expand a little bit more on this side of the highway, and my sort of in-universe lore for how this park would develop is that this part is all the old parks. So everything on this side of the highway is all the old parks. So I want to have most of the rides and buildings in this section. And then at some point they ran out of space to expand, so they bought the land on the other side of the highway. And so everything on the other side of the highway will be more of a recent expansion to the park. So it will be, I guess, a bit simpler with less foliage, but at the same time going for more intense and bigger rides. And also, I'm probably going to keep this part of the park quite empty, so it being a most recent expansion in that sense makes sense, I think, because I'm trying to also keep in mind that the guest goal for this scenario is quite low, so I can't really build that much. I only need to get to 550 guests, so just 1 or 2 coasters on this side of the highway should pretty much do it. I don't really need to make use of all of this space here. Now let's talk about the coaster for a bit, because this thing actually runs incredibly well, and it's the first time that I'm actually running 3 trains on a coaster. I could technically run 4 trains on this, but then there would always be one on the block brakes at the end, and it doesn't make the coaster that much more efficient. So let's actually take a look at how this thing runs. As you can see, it's really fast, except in this Cobra roll, of course, which is quite tight at the top. But altogether, I think it runs at a very realistic speed, considering that these things in real life also run really fast. I remember the first time I saw footage of Wonder Woman or Railblazer, either of the two, testing, and I was thinking to myself that it would never run at that speed in real life because it was looking absolutely crazy. But turns out that it actually does run at these speeds. For some reason these rides are just really fast, and I don't know if it's an optical illusion because of the small trains and the small tracks, but if you watch off-ride videos of either Wonder Woman or Railblazer, you can definitely tell just how fast these things are. So I think it's realistic, although I do have that sort of special element here of having this dive drop, which is very slow. It's crawling through this inversion just to give you some extra hang time. So yeah, altogether, I think the park is doing quite well. For now, I'm going to expand a bit more into this area, and then we'll see what I'm going to be able to build on the other side of the highway. So let's go. Alright, so I decided to build the Alzheimer's ride, which is something that I should probably use a bit more in this playthrough. I think it's a very underrated ride. It works out quite well, not just in Parkitect, but in real life as well, I think. It's a really good filler for the park. You know, it fills up space quite neatly, and it can just run between different kinds of rides, but it also fills up your day very well, I think. If you're in a less busy park and you've already done all of the rides and you just want to sit down for a bit, but you don't want to sit still on the bench, I personally like relaxing on one of these rides, or, you know, a gentle water ride or whatever. Just in general, the kinds of rides that Tripsdrill seems to have way too many of. So yeah, I actually really like these things. Maybe that's just me. It's definitely not a very popular opinion, but they're just nice. So yeah, also they usually have a pretty nice landscape around them, so it's fun to build in Parkitect as well, because they can fill up any different space that you need. Like if you have some really awkward space left that you don't really want to fit a flat ride in, or that doesn't really fit for a coaster, like this space over here, you could pretty much just come up with any kind of layout for these rides and put some landscaping around it and call it a day, and it should usually work quite well. And with this one, I'm bringing most of the focus to the station, which is just going to be a slightly fancy building here with a small square in front of it, which should hopefully fit a bit with the sort of English, French gardening style theming of the ride in general. Just in general, the whole antique cars is kind of, I don't know why, but to me it just seems to fit that whole aristocratic European theme quite well. Sort of the turn of the century, early 20th century kind of design, just because that's the general period that these cars are from as well. And there really isn't too much to it either. God, maybe you can tell that I'm trying to really push for some kind of thing to commentate about while I am building an old-timers ride of all things, because these things, as much as I might like them, there's really not too much to them. I'm just putting some basic hedges and trees around this, mostly also to hide the employee path, because actually I don't think that they counts as a negative scenery item in the same way that depot buildings do, for instance. So if you show your employee paths, I don't think it automatically, you know, makes the theming of a ride really bad, although I'm not sure on that. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong here. But in any case, I wanted to actually block this off a bit, because obviously you don't want to see the employee backstage areas when you're on this ride, and just putting some fences and hedges around it should generally work to fence all of that off. Now, in the space next to the jumper, I wanted to put an observation tower or a launched drop tower or something like that, a tower ride that fits on a very small footprint. And I kept pushing for my research, but I didn't get any of the rides that I wanted. So eventually I gave up and decided to put a small food court and toilet building in this, which is very close to the food court that I already had. So actually the only food that I'm selling in this thing is just one stall, and I forgot what it was exactly. But next to that I have some first aid room and a toilet as well. So it's just generally a pretty useful building, I think. Pretzels, or no, I was selling donuts in this building. There we go. I don't think we got pretzels in this map. But yeah, that more or less rounds up the old part of the park, and now I wanted to start on the new section on the other side of the highway. But before I did that, I needed to get an extra loan out because I was running out of money. Even though I was earning a very minute amount of money every month, I wanted to build a Giga Coaster, or really a hyper coaster here, although technically, I think it's just a mega coaster. I'm not going to confuse you with any more terminology. I wanted to build this coaster here, and I needed a lot of money to do that. And as you can clearly tell, that one loan was definitely not enough to do this, because this coaster is insanely expensive, not just as a coaster type, but also I'm trying to build a mega coaster, which are usually pretty huge. So it's just going to take a lot of money to build that thing. So in the meantime, I decided let's just keep the park running at a good speed and build a junior coaster, because I wanted to have one of these anyway, because I couldn't just put only very intense coasters in the park. And then hopefully by the time I'm done with this junior coaster, I'll be still at about the same amount of money, and I can get the extra income from the junior coaster and finance my big coaster with this. At least that was the plan. That didn't work out very well in the end. Spoilers. But yeah, that's what I was thinking at this point in time. Eventually, I just had to let the game run for a while I wasn't doing anything at that point, because I just needed to get some income to actually finally build the coaster. And building the coaster was way too expensive for my income flow to keep up with. So yeah, this whole plan kind of didn't work, but the junior coaster was planned anyway. And it's here to stay, so might as well build it at this point. And all of these layouts are getting really similar. I'm just trying to base all of these junior coasters on the typical standard Vekoma junior coasters that you see everywhere. So if the layouts start looking very similar for each of these, basically doing that on purpose. I know it's not the most interesting kind of layout to look at, because all of them just consist of simple helix based layouts, but that's just how these things are in real life, so I don't want to deviate too much from that. What is much more interesting actually in this case is, I guess, some of the scenery. I'm really trying to make this area look very different from the starting area, much newer and a bit more bare bones as well, because new areas in theme parks, they really tend to have much younger foliage and everything just hasn't grown quite as much. It doesn't usually have as much detailing, like little stalls and path elements everywhere. So everything over here is a bit more minimalistic and modern and sleek, if you will. Now I'm finally building the mega coaster again, and about the terminology, officially Intamin, which is the company that builds these, calls the coaster type a mega coaster. They are considered a hyper coaster if they're 200 feet or higher. They're considered a giga coaster if they're 300 feet or higher. And they're considered a strata coaster if they're 400 feet or higher, which only some of the launched coasters are, like King Dakar for instance. So it's a bit weird because there's very loose and narrow definitions of what a hyper coaster really is. But in this case, I think, you know, I'm not entirely sure because Parkitect doesn't work in feet and you can't exactly measure the distance off the ground like that. Not to mention that something inevitably kind of gets lost in the scaling of the game. But this is pretty much all things considered a hypercoaster, I think. Very much inspired by Hyperion in my case, although this coaster type is also in real life used for Intimidator 305 and Skyrush, for example. And Skyrush is actually a coaster which has a super similar color scheme to this one. I was initially actually not thinking of Skyrush when I came up with this color scheme. I was just moving through different colors. And I ended up with this specific combination of blue and yellow. But for me, this just looks best. I tried a good bunch of color schemes, but this is the one that stuck out to me most. It's slightly different to the Skyrush one, though. The Skyrush one has much brighter and more pale colors. But yeah, the layout is actually not that Skyrushy. It's definitely much more like Hyperion, which is a slightly more out and back hypercoaster. But at the same time, it's also very much compact, and it has a lot of turns and very small airtime hills. It's not necessarily my favorite Intamin coaster, but it's one that works out very well in this limited space, I think. Not to mention that, you know, I'm also building these coaster layouts very much to put the park on a pedestal for everybody who's driving through the highway, just because you'll have these big skylines of hypercoasters next to the highway. So that's just a way to draw people into the park. You know, these are pretty much my operating advertisements for the park to try and lure all of those truck drivers and cars into actually visiting this place. So obviously I want to put my biggest and baddest coasters right next to the highway here, which I guess is also something that a lot of real theme parks will do, especially in the US, where you get parks like Six Flags and Cedar Point putting some really big coasters next to the parking lots or entrance areas. And this is kind of the same thing, except in real life you'll obviously never have a theme park which actually straddles two sides of a highway. And I say that, but it actually does exist. I think Ravine Flyer 2 does this, for instance, is a coaster that goes across a highway. There are definitely examples of this, but it's not as common. But yeah. The coaster is pretty much finished at this point. I had to keep the layout quite short because for some reason the friction of this coaster type is actually a bit higher than it would be in real life, I think. This thing tends to slow down very quickly. I still managed to get a decent layout out of it, I think. But overall, it's not a very long coaster and it goes back into the station quite quickly because I also don't want the second half of the ride to be too slow. So yeah, there's not too much to the layout, and then everything when it comes to the scenery around this is all just very modern and minimalistic. I'm also using some slightly different foliage and fences and all these kinds of smaller elements to really help set this part of the park apart from the older part. Which I did realize having a monorail coaster in the older part doesn't make much sense because that's a very relatively recent coaster type. But I don't know, maybe this exists in a parallel universe where the monorail coaster was built earlier than it is, or maybe this is a park in the future or something like that. Anyway, that's just about it for this park, so let's return to an unpaused mode and see if we can make the objectives. Alright, so as you can see we need to hold the goals for, well, 3 weeks, that was originally, to win the scenario, so it is another one of these. So we'll be reaching the objectives very soon. But basically, this is the end result of this park, and actually I'm quite happy with this. Despite not really having a theme per se, I think there are some pretty charming areas to this park, like the main street / boulevard area here with these facades, as well as the area with the vintage cars. And just a new area, even though it looks very different, I think very well fits into the rest of the park as well. And having the skylines of these coasters line the sides of the highway, I think is really cool too. So I'm just gonna get to the end of the scenario and then I'll do a last POV of this coaster here, which interestingly, to return to that whole discussion about different coaster types and Giga Coasters and Hyper Coasters and Mega Coasters, the game considers this a Giga Coaster, which I guess is a very loose definition, which is just generally based on what coaster type this is. But again, I think this is not really a Giga Coaster, because usually when people talk about Giga Coasters, they mean a coaster which is 300 feet in height. But yeah, these definitions always kind of depend, but just the overall trend is a coaster that doesn't invert and that kind of goes out and back with a lot of airtime, and that's basically what this coaster is doing. Anyway, we reached the objectives, so I think it's finally a good time to do a quick POV of this coaster. And I know I keep calling it a POV, even though I know it's sort of off-ride, but for me, even though I don't want to break the isometric perspective, I do think it's really fun to follow the coasters along like this. So yeah, we go from a very steep drop into a quick, tight curve here, which pulls a lot of Gs, very similar to Intimidator 305, into a small airtime hill there, which is kind of like the thing that Hyperion tends to do a lot. And then some airtime hills alongside the highway here, of course, which according to the game don't pull that many negative Gs, but I think you might definitely get some really good airtime on this. It looks kind of like ejector airtime, but then again, I'm not entirely sure how to tell exactly how much G-forces you pull on a certain element, but just from looking, these definitely look like some good airtime hills. And it started to rain again, of course. I haven't mentioned this during the time lapses, but the rain was actually a major contribution to why I was struggling to finish this scenario, because while I was trying to make a profit, it kept raining, and every time it rained, people wouldn't ride the monorail coaster, and this is the only ride that made a substantial profit. So because of that, it was very difficult to actually get enough money to build the hyper coaster without, you know, letting the game run for a bit while I was absent. So yeah, I don't know, the rain kind of rained on my parade for this one. But I mean, I made it in the end, so I'm happy with the end result. But yeah, that's basically the park. And actually, let's check out the trophy that we get for this one. I remember that you actually get the bridge plus a part of the highway, but I'm not entirely sure. Let's quickly save this end result here and quit to the main screen. But yeah, I think we actually get a highway here, which should be pretty cool. Alright, so there it is. That's the bridge. And then it comes down in there. We don't actually get a highway next to it, but... Oh, we do! Oh, that's super cool. Actually came down later. And we even get some cars driving on it. Ooh, that's cool. And the next scenario is gonna be, oh, Orchard Acres. Well, that's one that I've seen quite a few finished results of. That's gonna be a fun one, but I'm not gonna get to that yet. I'm sorry for kind of teasing that one. For now, I really need to get to Biscayne Beach, I think, because that's a very popular scenario, and it's one that I've been looking forward to try for a long time. It's also notoriously difficult, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, that's something to look at in the next episode. For now, I want to end this by giving all of you guys a reminder that I just set up a Discord server at last. It was kind of random that I finally just decided to make one. Very impulsive decision, but if you're down to talk about Parkitect with some other people or with me, then you should totally check out my Discord server. I'll put an invite link in the description of this video, and yeah, we basically talk about Planet Coaster and Parkitect and City Skylines and basically all the videos that I make on my channel. So maybe I'll see you guys there, but in any case, I hope to see you guys in the next episode in Biscayne Beach. Bye guys!